Recently, I started noticing things in my office were slightly wrong. Insurance files rearranged in an order I would never use. Documents touched by hands that were not mine. After 45 years of building boats where a single misaligned plank can sink a crew, you learn to see what others miss. Then Maria, the woman who had kept my house for 15 years, grabbed my arm one morning and whispered, "They come every Tuesday at noon. You need to see it for yourself." I did not ask anything else. I pretended I would be out checking lobster pots off Cape Ann all day and waited. When the time came, I opened the camera feed on my phone, and what appeared on that screen nearly knocked the breath out of me. Welcome to our story. Before we reveal the footage, please like, subscribe, and let us know which city or country you are watching from. Note that this narrative includes dramatized elements for educational value. Any resemblance to actual names or events is coincidental. The core message, however, remains deeply relevant to us all. I walked into my home office on a Tuesday morning in October of 2023, and for the first few seconds, the world looked exactly as it should. Outside the window, the Atlantic was doing what it always does along the Gloucester coast, rolling and churning beneath a sky the color of old pewter, throwing white spray against the granite breakwater that has guarded this harbor for more than a century. The air coming through the cracked casement carried the smell of brine and diesel and the faint, sweet rot of rockweed drying on the shore. From where I stood, I could see the roofline of Callahan Marine Works down at the waterfront. That yard has been mine for 45 years. I built it from a single dry dock and a dream that smelled like epoxy and sawdust. Maria had already finished her morning routine and gone. The house was wrapped in that heavy salt-tinged stillness that usually feels like a sanctuary. Except today, it was not. When you spend half a century building vessels that have to survive nor'easters and the brutal chop of the North Atlantic, you develop a specific kind of sight. You do not just see a hull. You see the one fastener that is a quarter turn loose, the hairline crack in the keel timber that will become a catastrophic split once the sea gets inside it. Most people walk past these things. I have made a life by catching them. My eyes stopped on the heavy steel safe in the corner. It is a marine-grade Mosler, bolted to the floor joists. The dial was seated at 0 where I always leave it, but the handle was rotated a fraction of a degree past its resting point. If you have never operated a Mosler, that means nothing. If you have opened one 10,000 times over 4 decades, it means everything. I crossed the room, my boots making a low, hollow sound on the wide pine floorboards. Catherine and I had salvaged from a decommissioned sardine cannery the year we bought this house. I turned the dial, felt the heavy click of the tumblers, and pulled the door open. Inside, the folders were out of order. I keep my records organized by launch date and hull number, a system I have used since 1978. My property deeds sit at the front, tabbed by year. But now the deed for this house on the bluff was tucked behind the waterfront lease for the yard. The insurance binders for the commercial fleet were stuffed at the very back, their edges curled and snagged against the steel wall of the safe. My heart did not race. Instead, it went cold and dense, like an anchor dropping into black water. I sat down in the armchair by the window. It is a wingback covered in deep navy leather that has cracked and softened over 36 years of salt air. Catherine picked it out for me the autumn Callahan Marine Works landed its first 6-figure contract. "A man who builds ships needs a place to sit and watch the harbor, Tom," she had said. She has been gone 11 years. The leather still carries a ghost of the lavender hand cream she used every evening. On the mantelpiece sits a model ship. It is a half-hull replica of the first fishing vessel I ever restored. Hand-carved from white oak, 22 inches bow to stern. Catherine used to dust it every Sunday morning with a tenderness she usually reserved for living things. I always keep the bowsprit pointed toward the armchair, toward me. Now it was pointing at the window. I reached for the wooden box on the second shelf. It is handcrafted teak, a gift from a boatyard owner in Maine. I keep my will and my insurance policies inside. The brass clasp was facing the wrong direction. I opened the lid and the documents were all present, but they had been unfolded and refolded by someone in a hurry. I know how I fold my papers. Sharp, clean, 3 precise sections. The way you fold a chart, before stowing it in a wheelhouse drawer. These creases were soft, doubled in places, and the staples had been pulled back just enough to suggest someone had photocopied them. My mind went to Sunday dinner 3 days earlier. We had been at Kevin and Stacy's house in Marblehead Shores. Stacy had been unusually attentive, refilling my coffee before I asked. She has a smile that never quite reaches her eyes, a polished angular beauty I had always tried to appreciate for Kevin's sake. "Dad," she had said, her voice smooth as varnished mahogany, "have you thought about simplifying things? At your age, it might be time to step back from the yard. Sell the commercial units. Let someone else carry the weight." Kevin had nodded without looking up. "She is right, Dad. You have earned the right to rest." I had changed the subject, but the words circled me like gulls over a trawler hauling in its catch. I remembered last Thanksgiving when I spotted a credit card statement on their kitchen counter. The balance was large enough to buy a mid-range outboard motor for a 40-foot lobster boat. Kevin snatched it away so fast, he nearly sent a wine glass off the counter. "Only 3 people have keys to this house. Me, Kevin, and Stacy. Maria does not have a key. She arrives at 8 every morning, and I let her in myself. She leaves by noon, long before the afternoon light turns the harbor to hammered copper." I set the teak box down carefully, the brass clasp facing the window exactly as I had found it. I did not want them to know. I knew. I sat back in Catherine's chair and looked at the photograph on the bookshelf. A faded 5x7 from 1989. Kevin was 8. His face smudged with marine grease. His small hands gripping a model boat he had built from scrap mahogany in my workshop. I was kneeling beside him on the dock. At Pier 7, Catherine took that picture on a Sunday afternoon in July. I looked at that boy's eyes full of light and trust. Then I looked at the safe with its disturbed files and the box with the turned clasp. I did not recognize the hands that had been in this room, but I recognized the motive. The sanctuary was gone. The harbor I had trusted for 40 years was suddenly full of fog. I did not go to the yard that morning. Usually by 8:15, the smell of marine varnish and the low vibration of the belt sander are the only things occupying my mind. But I stayed in Catherine's chair, watching the dust motes drift through a slant of autumn light, and the machinery of Callahan Marine Works felt like it belonged to a different man in a different life. I picked up the phone instead. I did not wait for Maria to arrive at her usual time. I dialed her cell directly. She answered on the second ring. But the hello that came through the line was not the warm, rhythmic greeting I had heard for more than a decade. It was small and brittle. The sound of a woman who had been staring at the phone waiting for it to shatter in her hand. "Maria," I said, keeping my voice as level as a freshly faired hull. "I need to ask you something, and I need the honest truth. Have you noticed anything unusual at the house lately? Anything at all when I am not here?" There was a silence so long I thought the connection had dropped. I could hear the faint sound of a television in the background, her granddaughter's cartoons. Then came a ragged intake of breath, the kind that sounds like cloth tearing. "Mr. Callahan," she whispered, "I wanted to tell you. I have tried so many times. Every morning I drive here, and I think today is the day I will say it. And then I see your face. And I cannot make the words come out because I am so afraid of what will happen." The words poured out of her like water through a cracked hull. She told me that Kevin and Stacy had been coming to the house 6 or 7 times over the past 4 weeks, always on weekdays, always between 10 in the morning and noon, the precise window, when they knew I would be buried in hull inspections or supervising a refit down at the yard. They did not come to check on the house. They did not bring groceries or stop by to say hello. They went straight to my office, closing the heavy oak door behind them. "The last 3 times," Maria said, her voice hitching like a line caught in a block, "there was a man with them. A tall man. Salt and pepper hair. dark suit. He carried a leather briefcase that looked heavier than my grocery bag on a Sunday. Mr. Callahan. He moved through your house like he already owned it. She described a black Lincoln Navigator that pulled into the driveway behind Kevin's white BMW, polished so clean it looked like a mirror on wheels. The man never spoke to Maria. He never even looked at her. He simply followed Stacy through the front door, as though the house were a property listing he had already memorized. Then came the part that made my grip tighten on the phone until my knuckles turned white as dock line. 2 weeks ago, Maria told me. Kevin had pulled her aside in the kitchen. She said he had not been the boy who used to help her make Portuguese sweet bread during the holidays. He had stood over her near the refrigerator, his shadow long and cold on the tile floor, and his voice had dropped into a register she had never heard from him before. He told her that if she breathed a single word to me about their visits, he would make a phone call about her niece Sophia's visa renewal. Sophia had come from the Azores 3 years ago. There was a minor clerical delay in her paperwork, nothing unusual for immigration cases, but Stacy had apparently found a way to make the delay look like a red flag. Kevin held the girl's future in his hand like a fish on a gaff. And Maria knew that I could not protect someone the system had not yet cleared. I have been in this country 22 years, Mr. Callahan. She sobbed, her voice cracking into pieces. I have my daughters, my grandbabies. I have cleaned your house and prayed for your family every single night since Mrs. Catherine was still alive. She held my hand the morning I was sick. Do you remember that? She drove me to the hospital herself. And now, your son. He looked at me like I was nothing. Not like family. Just a witness he needed to silence. I did not lose my temper. Rage is a luxury for men who have not yet formed a plan. And something behind my ribs was already beginning to take shape. Cold and precise. Like the steel frame of a vessel on the building ways. I took a breath. The room still smelled of Catherine's lavender. Maria, I said softly. How many years have you looked after this family? 15 years, Mr. Callahan. She choked out. Since before Mrs. Catherine went to the hospital for the last time. Then I need you to do something for me. I told her. I need you to tell me everything you heard. Every voice through that door. Every car in the driveway. Every time they came, and every time they left. She told me about the most recent visit, this past Friday. They had been inside the office for nearly 2 hours. Maria was polishing the banister in the hallway, but the house was so quiet she could hear the rhythm of their voices through the oak. Kevin sounded hesitant, his words low and tangled together, but Stacy sounded like a harbor master directing a fleet, efficient, cold, each sentence landing with the weight of an order that expected no argument. I will send you a message, Maria whispered as we neared the end of the call. I wrote down the times, every visit, every car. I kept a record because I felt it in my heart, Mr. Callahan. Something is very wrong in this house. We hung up. A minute later, my phone vibrated against my palm. I looked at the text. Her handwriting would have been neater, but the words were clear enough to cut glass. They come every Tuesday at noon. That is when they always come. That is when you will see everything. I looked at the message, then shifted my gaze to the clock on the mantelpiece, the old brass ship's clock Catherine had bought at an estate sale in Rockport. It was nearly 8 in the morning, 28 hours. I had 28 hours until tomorrow's tide crossed that noon mark. 28 hours to decide whether I was going to let the current carry me out past the breakwater where no anchor can hold, or plant my keel in the mud and refuse to move. I looked at my hands. They were scarred, calloused, and steady. They had laid every plank in the dry dock. They had held Catherine's fingers the night she stopped breathing. Now they were going to have to protect everything those years had built. I reached out and turned the key. The Ford F-250's engine answered with a low, heavy growl that vibrated through the steering column and into my scarred palms. By noon I was heading south on Route 128, the Massachusetts coastline sliding past my window in a blur of rust-colored marsh grass and granite outcrops. The October sky had turned a hard, bright blue, the kind that makes the dying leaves look almost violent against the horizon. I did not drive to the electronics retailers in the shopping plaza near the Gloucester Rotary. I drove past them without a second look. Instead, I followed the highway toward Salem until I found what I was looking for. A small, dusty shop wedged between a marine chandlery and a sandwich place with a faded awning. The kind of store where the transactions do not leave digital footprints, where a careful man can pay in folded bills and walk out without a trace that a curious daughter-in-law with access to bank statements could follow. The shop smelled of solder and old cardboard. A young man with dark circles under his eyes looked up from a disassembled circuit board. I did not waste his time, and he did not waste mine. I told him I needed something small, wireless, and capable of sending a high-definition feed to my phone through a secure cloud server. He reached behind the counter and set a box in front of me no larger than a pack of playing cards. "Motion activated," he said, tapping the side of the box with a screwdriver. "Night vision. Pings your phone the second it detects movement. Records to a private server with end-to-end encryption." He showed me how to pair it, how to calibrate the sensitivity so a moth would not trip the sensor, and how to pull up the live feed from any location with a cell signal. I listened with the same focused attention I give when a marine surveyor is walking me through a stress test report on a keel joint. When he finished, I pulled a roll of bills from my shirt pocket, counted out the amount, and left them on the counter. No receipt. No name. I took the small brown bag and walked back into the sharp autumn air. The drive home felt different. The Ford felt less like a truck and more like a vessel that had just been loaded with ordnance. I kept the brown bag on the passenger seat and my eyes on the road, but my mind was already measuring angles and sightlines inside the office, like a shipwright calculating the rake of a mast. I spent 20 minutes in the room, not sitting, but moving with a deliberate patience that I usually reserve for fitting a plank to a curved frame. I tested a dozen positions. The top of the safe was too exposed, the first place anyone would sweep with a suspicious glance. The bookshelf offered better cover, but the gaps between volumes were too shallow to hide anything without a visible bulge. I considered the curtain rod, the underside of the desk, the gap between the baseboard and the wainscoting. Then I looked at the mantelpiece, and I knew. The model ship. Catherine's ship. 22 inches of hand-carved white oak, a half-hull replica with a hollow interior that I had never sealed because Catherine liked to tuck little notes inside it on our anniversary. I had not opened it since the year she died. I lifted the model carefully, feeling its familiar weight settle into my palms. I turned it over. The base panel was held by 4 brass screws that I had countersunk myself more than 30 years ago. I removed them with a jeweler's screwdriver, set the panel aside, and looked at the empty cavity inside the hull. It was more than large enough. I nestled the camera lens into the small gap at the bow, angling it so it peered out through the tiny hawse hole I had drilled when I carved the original anchor detail. From the outside, the opening was decorative, invisible unless you pressed your eye against it. From the inside, it provided a clean, unobstructed view of the desk, the safe, and the office door. I replaced the base panel, tightened the screws, and set the model back on the mantelpiece with the bowsprit pointing at the window, exactly where they had left it. I walked outside, climbed into the truck, and pulled up the application on my phone. The image snapped into focus, and the sight of it made the hair on my arms rise. My office from above. The colors slightly muted but the detail razor sharp. I could see the grain of the pine on my desk. I could read the brass lettering on the ship's clock. I could see the turned clasp on the teak box. I was 200 feet from my own front door, yet I was inside the room. Invisible, but watching everything. I walked back in and stood before the mantelpiece for a long moment. The model ship sat there, steady and silent, the way Catherine used to sit on the porch, watching the harbor at dusk. I had hidden a spy inside the last object my wife ever loved. The thought settled in my chest like ballast shifting in a hold. I picked up my phone and called Kevin. 51 years of bidding on contracts against men who would eat you alive for a 1/10 of a percentage point teaches you how to keep the tremor out of your throat, even when your pulse is knocking against your collarbone. "I'm heading out to check the lobster pots off Cape Ann tomorrow, son," I said, leaning against the doorframe. Charlie Briggs says the bugs have been running heavy near the old shipping lane. I am going to make a day of it. We'll not be back until well after dark. Sounds good, Dad, Kevin replied. There was a split-second pause. A quick inhale on his end that a stranger would have missed. You deserve the break. Enjoy yourself out there. Do not worry about a thing. His voice was lighter, relieved. It was the sound of a man who had just watched a bulkhead door swing open that he expected to stay locked. I felt something sharp and metallic rise in the back of my throat. The taste of a betrayal that was no longer just a suspicion. Take care, Kevin, I said. I hung up before my voice could betray me. That evening, the house settled into darkness around me. I sat in the office with only the desk lamp on, its warm circle of light falling across the model ship on the mantelpiece. Tomorrow, that little vessel, carved by my hands, loved by my wife, would either save my harbor or confirm that it was already lost. I clicked off the lamp and left the room to the night and the unblinking eye hidden inside the bow. Wednesday morning I left the house at 7, drove to the end of Harbor Loop Road, where the pavement turns to packed dirt, and parked behind a stand of old pitch pines near the base of the abandoned lighthouse on Eastern Point. The trees provided a natural screen, their twisted salt-stunted branches, partially hidden by a thin morning fog that clung to the granite ledges overlooking the outer harbor. I was no more than 200 yards from my own front door, yet I felt like I was sitting in a foreign port, watching someone else's life through a telescope. The cab of the Ford cooled quickly once I killed the engine. The October air crept in through the seams of the door, sharp and briny. My fishing gear sat untouched in the bed of the truck. 3 rods, a tackle box, and a cooler of ice. A silent alibi for anyone who might notice a truck parked near the old light. My phone was propped against the dashboard, the camera application open. The image of my office was steady, bathed in the flat gray light of a morning that did not know what it was about to witness. Hours crawled past. The fog burned off, and the sun came through hard and indifferent, throwing long shadows across the pine needles on the hood. 10 o'clock. 11. The coffee in my thermos went cold, but I did not drink. I just watched the screen. A hunter in a blind, waiting for the sound of something moving through the brush. Nothing happened until 7 minutes past noon. A white BMW X7 turned into my driveway with a quiet, expensive crunch of gravel. Kevin was behind the wheel. Stacy sat in the passenger seat, her profile sharp and focused as a compass needle. A second later, a black Lincoln Navigator pulled in directly behind them, its polished bodywork throwing back the sky like a dark mirror. From the rear door stepped the man Maria had described. Tall, salt and pepper hair cropped close, a charcoal suit that fit him the way a custom hull fits its frame. He moved with a practiced, predatory ease, a heavy leather briefcase swinging at his side, as though the weight inside it were something he carried every day of his professional life. I watched on the small screen as Kevin used his key. They walked through the front door of the house I had built with my own hands. The house where Catherine had died, where I had raised a son who was now leading strangers into my sanctuary as though it were an open house on a Sunday afternoon. Moments later, the 3 of them appeared in my office. The camera inside the model ship captured everything with a cold, forensic clarity. Stacy did not hesitate. She went straight to the safe, her movements practiced and efficient. The movements of someone who had done this before and expected to do it again. She did not look at the bookshelf or the photographs. She did not look at the model ship her mother-in-law used to dust every Sunday morning. She looked at the room the way a marine salvage company looks at a wreck, not with respect, but with arithmetic. She pulled out the property deeds and spread them across my desk, smoothing the papers with a flat, steady palm. The man opened his briefcase, his back angled slightly toward the mantelpiece. From inside, he withdrew a stack of documents held together with a black binder clip. "Everything is here," Stacy said, her voice coming through the phone speaker with a clarity that froze the blood in my wrists. "The house, the waterfront lease, the commercial fleet insurance, the company shares, all of it." The man tapped the documents with a silver pen. I have the transfer instruments prepared. The language is airtight. We just need his signature. How confident are you that he will sign? Kevin spoke. His voice was lower than the others, lacking Stacy's blade-like edge, thick and reluctant like a line paying out under too much strain. Once we move him into the facility, he will sign whatever we put in front of him just to get it over with. Facility. The word hit me like a rogue wave breaking over a wheelhouse, not a retirement cottage where a man could still smell the salt and hear the gulls. A facility, a warehouse for human beings who had been reclassified as liabilities. To them, I was not a father, not a man who had built a shipyard from a borrowed welding torch and $40 in the bank. I was a piece of aging equipment that had outlived its service life, something to be hauled out and stripped for parts. Stacy continued, her finger tracing a line on one of the deeds. Dr. Winslow has agreed. He will certify early-stage cognitive decline. It is a standard diagnosis for a man his age. Once we have the assessment filed, the guardianship petition is straightforward. The court will not even question it. Kevin picked up the waterfront lease. For a long moment he stood there holding the paper, staring at the ink. Maybe he was thinking about the summers we spent on the dock at Pier 7. Maybe he was remembering the sound of Catherine's laughter carrying across the water on a still August evening. Stacy glanced at him, her eyes narrowing to slits. "Kevin," she said. He did not look at her. He gave a short, jerky nod and set the paper down. "Let us just get it done." They began gathering the documents. The man slid them into his briefcase with the efficient hands of someone who packages other people's lives for a living. Before they turned to leave, Kevin walked toward the mantelpiece. He stopped directly in front of the model ship. I held my breath. My fingers locked around the steering wheel until the tendons in my forearms stood out like dock lines under load. Through the lens hidden in the bow of that little vessel, I was looking directly into my son's eyes. He stood there for 3 full seconds. He was staring at the ship his mother used to dust every Sunday. The ship his father had carved from a single block of white oak in the same workshop where he had once built his first model boat from scraps. His expression was unreadable. Not guilt. Not sorrow. Just a hollow, distant stillness, like the flat calm that sometimes falls over the ocean before a storm rearranges the entire coast. Then he turned away and followed Stacy out of the office. The door closed behind them. I watched the BMW and the Navigator back out of the driveway and disappear down Harbor Loop Road, the black vehicle trailing the white one like a shadow following its master. I sat there for a long time. The fishing gear remained in the bed of the truck. The ice in the cooler was melting into a pool of cold water that I could hear sloshing faintly when the wind rocked the Ford on its springs. The only thing I had caught today was a sonar reading of the reef my own blood was steering me toward, and the depth was shallower than I had feared. I drove home after they left. The gravel under my tires sounded like crushed shell in the silence of the afternoon. When I stepped inside, I did not reach for the light. I let the front door click shut behind me and stood in the foyer, while the gray October twilight slowly swallowed the hallway whole. I did not go into the office. I could not. The safe with its rearranged files, the model ship with its hidden eye still recording the empty room, the leather chair Catherine had chosen. It all felt like the set of a play I no longer wanted a part in. Instead, I walked into the living room and sat on the old blue sofa where Catherine used to read on Sunday afternoons, a dog-eared paperback in one hand and a cup of tea balanced on her knee. I did not take off my jacket. I just sat there in the thickening dark with my hands heavy on my knees, and I did not move for a long time. In the boat business, when a structural timber fails, you can usually trace the fracture back to a single point of stress. A knot in the grain. A fastener hole drilled too close to the edge. One weak spot where the sea found a way in. But as I sat there, the questions that hit me did not come from a single point. They came from everywhere, like water flooding a hull through 100 tiny seams at once. It was not about Stacy. I understood Stacy now. She was a nor'easter in human form, cold and systematic, a force that had found the weakest joint in my family's hull and had been working it open for years. My questions were all for Kevin. I thought about the July morning in 1979 when he was born. The hospital in Beverly smelled of antiseptic and floor polish. His hand had clamped around my index finger with a grip that seemed impossible for something that weighed less than a bolt of sailcloth. He would not let go. The nurse laughed and said he had a boat builder's grip already. I thought about the autumn afternoon when he was 12, sitting in the passenger seat of the old pickup on the dirt road behind the property. I had let him take the wheel for the first time, and his knuckles had gone white on the steering column. His jaw clenched so tight I could see the tendons in his neck, but his eyes were blazing with a fierce, terrified pride that I recognized because it was the same look I had worn the first time I took a vessel out of the harbor alone. But the memory that hurt the most was the afternoon Catherine died. We were in a corridor at the hospital in Salem, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like trapped insects. I was broken. The woman who had been my compass, Rose, for 31 years was gone, and the needle inside me was spinning without direction. Kevin had come straight from work. He did not say a word. He sat down beside me on that plastic bench, and we stayed there for 4 hours, shoulder to shoulder, while the hospital moved around us like a tide flowing past two rocks on a beach. He did not offer platitudes. He did not tell me it would be all right. He just placed his hand on my forearm and left it there. A steady weight that told me I was not adrift. That was the last time I felt like his father in the way that truly counted. That was the last time our bond was made of something stronger than blood and habit, and the thin, brittle wire of obligation. Around 1 a.m, the house was so quiet I could hear the old ship's clock on the mantelpiece ticking in the office down the hall. Each stroke sounded like a mallet striking a caulking iron, driving silence deeper into the seams. I picked up my phone. The screen flared white in the dark room. I scrolled to Kevin's number. My thumb hovered over the call button. Trembling for the first time all day, I thought, just let it go, Tom. Give them the yard. Give them the house. Give them the waterfront lease and the fleet insurance and every bolt and plank you have ever owned. What does any of it matter if the boy you raised is already gone? Maybe the facility is where you belong. Maybe you are just an old hull that has outlived its survey certificate, and the kindest thing is to let them tow you to the breaker's yard. I reached out to set the phone down on the side table. My fingers brushed against something cold and smooth. Catherine's anchor pendant. It is a small piece of brass on a thin chain, no longer than my little finger. She bought it from an old metalsmith on Bearskin Neck in Rockport the year we opened the yard. She wore it every day, for 31 years, through the winters when we heated the house with scrap timber from the shop and the summers when the contracts finally started coming in faster than we could build. After she passed, I placed it on that side table beside the lamp. I have never moved it. The brass caught a sliver of moonlight coming through the window. I picked it up. The metal warmed in my palm the way it used to warm against her skin, and I heard her voice. Not the soft version from dreams, but the real one. The one that told me to stand up straight when the bank tried to call in our first loan. The one that told me an anchor does not choose when the sea gets rough. An anchor holds, Tom, she used to say. That is all it has to do. I put the phone face down on the cushion. I was not going to call Kevin. Not to surrender. Instead, I dialed Pastor Frank. It was past 2 a.m, an hour for emergencies and men who have run out of dark to sit in. He answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep but instantly steady. Tom? He said. What is it? I am all right, Frank, I said, and my voice sounded like something being dragged across a gravel beach. I just need to hear someone I trust. Someone who remembers who I am. I am right here, Tom. For nearly 10 minutes we stayed on the line in silence. I could hear his breathing, and he could hear mine. It was a bridge thrown across a dark channel, nothing fancy, just strong enough to hold the weight of one man's doubt. Before we hung up, Frank said one thing. You have never lost a vessel in a storm, Tom. Every ship you ever touched came home. Do not start losing them now. I did not answer, but I knew he was right. I set the phone down, and in the silence that followed, I felt the brass pendant still warm in my closed fist. The harbor outside was black and still, but somewhere beneath the surface, the anchor chain was pulling taut. By morning, I would know what kind of captain I was. I did not sleep. I did not try. At 4:30, the first gray light bled into the eastern sky above the breakwater, and I stood up from the sofa, my joints stiff from 6 hours of sitting in the cold. I made a pot of coffee in the kitchen and stood by the back door watching the dawn crawl across the harbor, lighting up the roofline of Callahan Marine Works and the old granite seawall where Catherine used to sit with her sketchbook on summer evenings. The time for questions was over. The time for the father had passed. The time for the man who built that yard from a borrowed welding torch had arrived. At exactly 7 o'clock, I picked up my phone. My thumb did not tremble. I dialed the number for Arthur McGuire. Arthur McGuire has had an office on Main Street in Gloucester for 30 years. It is a red brick building 3 doors down from the harbormaster's office, with a solid oak door and a brass nameplate that has been polished so many times the serifs on the letters have worn smooth. I have been his client for 27 of those years. He handled the incorporation of Callahan Marine Works, the negotiation of the waterfront lease, the purchase of the commercial fleet insurance, and the quiet, devastating paperwork when Catherine died. I arrived at 8:45 and sat in the Ford for 5 minutes, watching the morning foot traffic on Main Street. Lobstermen heading down to the docks with thermoses and cigarettes. A woman opening the door of the bakery. The scent of fresh bread drifting across the sidewalk. People moving through their lives in a town where fathers do not normally get ambushed by their own sons. I stepped out, tucked my phone into my jacket pocket, and walked inside. Arthur did not make me wait. He waved off a younger associate with a flick of his hand and pointed me toward the heavy wingback chair across from his desk. I did not offer small talk. I set my phone on his blotter, opened the camera application, and pressed play. He watched the footage twice. The first time he leaned forward, his reading glasses sliding down his nose, his eyes tracking every movement on the screen with the precision of a man who has spent 3 decades separating truth from theater. The second time he sat back, his hands steepled beneath his chin, his breathing slow and measured. Arthur is the kind of lawyer who learned long ago not to let his face move before his mind has finished its calculations. He has seen every species of greed that a New England fishing town can produce. But when the footage reached the 3-second mark, the moment Kevin stood before the model ship and stared into the carved hull where his mother's memory lived, I saw Arthur's jaw tighten. The muscle along his jawline bunched and held, the involuntary reaction of a man who has just watched something cross a line he thought he understood. He slid the phone back across the blotter and spoke. His voice was a low, steady baritone that carried the weight of a harbormaster's horn cutting through fog. "Tom," he said, "what they are doing is elder financial exploitation under Massachusetts general law. It is a specific and ugly category of theft. If Dr. Winslow submits a falsified cognitive assessment to a probate court, that is perjury. If they attempt to execute those transfer documents under a fraudulent guardianship, that is criminal fraud. This is not a family disagreement about an inheritance, Tom. This is a criminal conspiracy." We spent the next 2 hours in a focused clinical silence, broken only by the scratch of Arthur's fountain pen and the rustle of legal paper. The morning sun shifted across the brick wall outside his window, and by the time it reached the brass nameplate on the front door, Arthur had prepared the documents to transfer every asset I owned into an irrevocable living trust. The house on the bluff, the waterfront lease for Callahan Marine Works, the commercial fleet insurance policies, every tool, every dry dock cradle, every plank of timber in the storage shed. He pushed the stack of papers across the desk and looked me directly in the eye. "Here is how it works, Tom. The trust is now the legal owner of these assets. You are the trustee. Even if a court were to be deceived into granting Kevin and Stacy guardianship over you personally, they cannot touch a single nail that is held inside this trust. Think of it as an ironclad hull. They can try to board you, but they cannot breach the waterline." Arthur paused, tapping his pen against the blotter. "Now, We have two headings we can steer. We take this evidence to the district attorney's office today and end this before sunset. Or we wait. Wait! I repeated. We let them file their petition. We let them stand before a judge and swear to those lies under oath. And then we walk into that courtroom and we close the trap around them in a place where the tide cannot carry them away. No claims of misunderstanding. No retreat into good intentions. We catch them under sail with stolen cargo in the hold. I felt the weight of Catherine's anchor pendant in my trouser pocket. I had carried it with me since 4 a.m, and the other path ends it faster. I said, "It does." But faster leaves them room to claim they were merely discussing options, that they were acting out of concern. It gives Stacy an exit, and I suspect she has already planned for that. I looked out the window at Main Street. A lobster boat was motoring out past the breakwater, its wake cutting a clean white line through the dark green water. I thought about Kevin's voice on the phone, the relief in it when he thought I would be gone all day. I thought about the word facility dropping from his mouth like an anchor into mud. "I choose to wait," I said. "I want there to be no channel left for them to run, Arthur." "None." Arthur nodded slowly. "Then until the hearing, you act normal. You answer their calls. You sit at their table if they invite you. You let them believe their plan is running with the precision of a Swiss chronometer." "Can you do that?" "I have been reading Difficult Seas for 50 years, I replied. "I can hold a heading for a few more days." Before I stood to leave, Arthur added something I had not expected. "I am going to brief the district attorney's office tonight. Not to file charges yet. I want them standing by with investigators in the gallery when the time comes. If we are doing this in open court, I want the law ready to move the moment the gavel falls." I stopped at the door, my hand on the cold brass handle. "Arthur, if this were your son, what would you do?" The silence that followed was as heavy as a keel timber. Arthur looked at a framed photograph on his own desk. A young woman in a graduation gown. A grandson on a beach. He drew a long, slow breath through his nose. "Exactly what we are doing right now, Tom," he said. "Because the greatest mercy you can show a man who has lost his bearing is to stop him before he runs aground." I drove home with the trust documents in a folder on the passenger seat. The afternoon sun was hitting the harbor, turning the water to hammered brass. The house was protected. The yard was protected. Even the leather chair Catherine had picked out was now shielded behind a wall of ink and legal precedent. I was not drifting anymore. I had dropped anchor, and the chain was set deep in rock. The following Monday, Arthur called me at the yard before I had finished my first cup of coffee. The morning air inside the main shop was dense with the smell of epoxy resin and white oak shavings. The steady rhythmic whine of the planer on the far wall vibrated through the concrete floor the way it always does, a sound that usually centers me the way a compass needle finds north. But the urgency in Arthur's voice knocked the world off its heading. "Tom, sit down," he said, skipping the pleasantries entirely. "I had my forensic accountant pull the access logs on the Callahan Marine Works server over the weekend. We found a ghost in the rigging. According to the logs, someone using internal administrative credentials had accessed the restricted financial archive at 11 o'clock at night on 3 separate occasions over the past 4 weeks. They were not browsing invoices or checking payroll. They were downloading deep-tier records, asset valuations, year-over-year revenue projections, the full contract portfolio for our Boston and Portland clients, and the detailed appraisal of the waterfront lease. The login credentials belonged to Eddie Byrne. I looked through my office window. Eddie was out on the shop floor 40 feet away, leaning over a work table with a calculator and a stack of receipts. He had been my bookkeeper for 12 years. A quiet, meticulous man with wire-rimmed glasses and a habit of tapping his pen against his teeth when the numbers did not balance. I had trusted him the way you trust the depth gauge on a vessel. You do not think about it. You just believe the reading it gives you. "I will handle it, Arthur," I said. I called Eddie into my office and closed the heavy glass door, sealing out the scream of the planer and the clatter of the rivet gun from Bay 2. I did not ask him to sit. I turned my computer monitor so he could see the access log, the timestamps glowing red against the white background like warning lights on a bridge console. Eddie did not try to bluff. He looked at the screen, and for a long moment the only sound was the hum of the overhead fluorescent and the muffled pulse of the yard working beyond the glass. The color left his face the way water drains from a dry dock, slowly at first and then all at once, leaving him gray and hollowed out. He held himself rigid for about 30 seconds, the posture of a man trying to keep his mast straight in a crosswind. Then it broke. His shoulders dropped, and he let out a long, shuddering breath that fogged the air between us. "I did not take any money, Tom," he whispered. "I swear on my mother's grave. Not a cent." Stacy had approached him 5 months ago at a diner on Bass Avenue. She did not come with a bribe. She came with a folder. Inside were records of falsified expense entries Eddie had submitted 6 years earlier, nearly 60 small charges totaling roughly $3,500. At the time, Eddie had been drowning in a gambling problem he had hidden from everyone at the yard. He had clawed his way out of that hole on his own, but Stacy had found the trail he thought he had buried. She told him the arrangement was simple. Give her the internal financial data she needed to evaluate the Callahan family assets, and the folder stayed in her private safe. Refuse. And the records went to the district attorney and to me. "I tried to find a way to tell you," Eddie said, his eyes wet and glassy behind his wire frames. "But every time I came close, she was there. At the company cookout last summer, at your Sunday dinners, she would just catch my eye across the room and smile. It was like carrying a grenade in my coat pocket, and she was the only person holding the pin." The door opened. Jimmy Santos stepped in without knocking, which meant something was wrong because Jimmy only skips the knock when the shop is on fire or the news cannot wait. He was holding his phone, his broad, weathered face pulled tight. "Sal Medeiros just called me," Jimmy said. "He is a wreck, Tom." He could barely get the words out. "Jimmy told me that Sal, one of the most respected lobster boat captains in the harbor, a man I have known for 30 years, had broken down on the phone and confessed that he had been coerced into signing a formal complaint alleging that Callahan Marine Works had failed to meet safety standards on 3 recent refits. He was not the only one. At least 4 other captains in the Gloucester fleet had signed similar documents. Stacy had purchased their outstanding debts through a shell company called Atlantic Harbor Holdings. New England commercial fishing has been brutal for a decade. Fuel costs, quota cuts, and aging vessels have left many captains leveraged to the waterline. Stacy found the ones who were taking on water, and she bought their paper. Then she used that leverage like a tiller, steering them wherever she needed them to go. The complaints were designed to build a regulatory case that Callahan Marine Works was being mismanaged, evidence that would support the guardianship petition by proving I was no longer competent to run my own business. I looked at Eddie. "How long has she had this evidence on you? How long has she been holding those reports?" Eddie looked down at his work boots. "When she first contacted me 5 months ago, I asked her that. I asked how she even found records that old. She told me she had been collecting contingencies on everyone close to the Callahan family since before she ever married Kevin. She said she liked to be prepared for every outcome." The words landed in the room like a depth charge detonating beneath the keel. Since before she married Kevin, she had walked into our family with a surveyor's eye and a predator's patience, mapping every weakness, identifying every person I trusted, and quietly turning them into switches she could flip when the time was right. I stood and walked to the window. Below me, the yard was alive. The same lathes and saws and steam boxes I had bought with a high-interest loan when Callahan Marine Works was just 4 men in a rented bay on the inner harbor. I watched them work, precise and indifferent, doing the job they were designed for. She collected that evidence before she ever sat down for her first Sunday dinner in my house, I said. I was not speaking to Eddie or Jimmy. I was speaking to the ghost of the family I thought I had. Stacy had not married into this family. She had boarded it. She had spent years charting the structural weaknesses of my life, sounding the depth of every relationship, And she had done it all while smiling across the table and passing the bread. I turned back to Eddie. I am not calling the police on you, Eddie. Not today. But tomorrow you go to the district attorney's office and you make a full sworn statement. Arthur will be with you. I will stand behind you through whatever comes next. Eddie blinked. Why? After what I did. Because you did not do it for money. You did it because you were scared. And because it is exactly what Catherine would have wanted me to do. After Eddie left, I stood alone in the office. The picture I had been holding in my mind since Tuesday. The image of Kevin as the architect of this siege shifted and warped until it no longer held its shape. My son was not the shipwright of this conspiracy. He was just another plank she had bent to fit the hull she was building around me. She assumed that by cutting my rigging, she controlled my ship. She forgot that I am the one who built the hull, and I know exactly where every plank is fastened. In the 8 days that followed, they came back twice. I watched both times from the yard, sitting in the Ford in the gravel lot beside the main shop where the air smelled of hot asphalt and the distant metallic shriek of the angle grinder from Bay 4. The phone propped on the dashboard, the camera feed open, the little ship on the mantelpiece recording everything with the patience of a lighthouse beam sweeping a dark coast. But this time I was not watching what they were doing. I had already seen the deeds and the binder clips and the silver pen. This time I was watching how they did it. I was studying the structural integrity of their partnership, the way I study the framing of a hull before I commit to a refit. The first return visit was on a Tuesday. Just Kevin and Stacy. No lawyer. They entered the office with the ease of people who had already measured the air for curtains. Stacy went straight to my desk, pulling out a yellow legal pad and a pen she had brought in her handbag. She began cross-referencing the papers from the safe with a list she already had, highlighting sections of the waterfront lease with a pink marker, her movements as crisp and practiced as a navigator, plotting waypoints on a chart. Kevin did not sit. He drifted. He stood behind her for a moment, his hands in his pockets, watching over her shoulder the way a deckhand watches a captain work the wheel, present but peripheral. He did not suggest anything. He did not point to a folder or question a number. He waited for her to indicate, and then he would nod. At one point, while Stacy was absorbed in a section of the commercial fleet insurance, Kevin walked away from the desk. He went to the window and stood there for nearly a full minute, staring out at the backyard and the slope of granite that runs down to the harbor. I could see what he was looking at. The old tire swing I had hung from the pitch pine 25 years ago when he was a boy who still believed his father was the strongest man on the coast. The tire had weathered to a cracked gray circle, the rope bleached white by decades of salt air, but it was still there, turning slowly in the October wind, like a pendulum, measuring the distance between the past and whatever this had become. His shoulders were slumped. His reflection in the glass looked thin and translucent, the ghost of a man superimposed on the landscape of his childhood. Stacy did not look up. She did not ask what he was thinking. She did not seem to register that he had left her side. She just kept writing, her pen moving across the legal pad with a rhythmic, predatory efficiency that reminded me of the way a trawl net moves through deep water, gathering everything in its path without discrimination. The second visit came 3 days later, on a Friday, and this time the lawyer was back. The audio on the camera was clean enough to pick up the click of his cufflinks against the surface of my desk. They were finalizing the timeline. Dr. Winslow will file the medical assessment on Thursday, the lawyer said, his voice as dry and precise as a set of specifications typed on legal bond. We will have the emergency guardianship petition before the judge by Friday morning. By Friday afternoon, Kevin, you will have signature authority over all accounts. We move for the freeze on the marine assets immediately after. Stacy leaned back in my chair. Catherine's chair. She crossed her legs and folded her hands on the armrest with the proprietary calm of a woman who had already redecorated the room in her mind. And the facility. Is the room ready? Reserved and paid, the lawyer replied. She gave a single nod, a sharp downward motion that closed the subject like a hatch being dogged shut. "What about the housekeeper?" Stacy asked suddenly, her eyes cutting toward Kevin. "Maria. She has seen us here. She is not stupid." This was the part I played back 3 times that night in the silence of the shop office. Kevin straightened in his seat. He looked at Stacy, and for a moment something passed across his face. A flicker of hesitation, a crack in the plaster, but it sealed itself almost instantly. "She will not say a word," he said. "I have handled it." His voice did not carry the weight of a man giving an order. It did not have the steel of conviction or the depth of authority. It sounded rehearsed. It sounded like a boy in a school play delivering a line he had practiced until the meaning had been ground out of it, leaving nothing but the shape of the words. He was saying what he thought a powerful man was supposed to say, to keep a woman like Stacy satisfied, and it was the most hollow sound I had heard since the last echo faded in the hospital corridor the afternoon Catherine stopped breathing. I called Arthur that evening from the yard. The night shift was just starting, the sparks from the grinders cascading through the shadows like orange rain. Jimmy was supervising a hull repair in Bay 1, the blue flash of the welding torch strobing against the far wall. "Ready," I told Arthur. "They are moving on Friday." "Good," Arthur said, his voice steady over the line. "The district attorney is fully briefed. He has assigned 2 investigators from the Financial Crimes Unit to be in the gallery. We have the trust, the video, the grill recording that we have not made yet, and Eddie's sworn affidavit. We will be ready, Tom. Just hold your course for 4 more days." "4 days," I said. I hung up and looked at the calendar tacked to the wall above the tool bench. It was the one Maria gave me every Christmas. A simple, spiral-bound thing, with photographs of the Massachusetts coastline, lighthouses and dunes, and the broad gray sweep of the Atlantic in winter. I looked at the date and marked it with a heavy black X from the grease pencil I keep on the bench for marking cut lines on timber. 4 days until the trap closed. But as I stood there beneath the fluorescent lights with the sound of steel being shaped echoing through the bay, something strange happened. The rage I had been carrying for Kevin began to shift, watching that footage again in my mind, seeing him stand at the window staring at a tire swing while the woman who steered his life did not even notice he had left the desk. I did not just feel anger. I felt a cold, sharp pity that cut deeper than the anger ever had. I was looking at a man who had traded his own keel for the illusion of being carried. He was not the storm. He was the vessel the storm had commandeered, and he had forgotten how to take the wheel back. 4 days. I would protect my yard, and I would protect my house. But the sun I was trying to remember was already adrift, somewhere I could not reach. The countdown had begun, and when the tide turned, only one heading would lead to safe water. Thursday came the way bad days always arrive on the coast, quietly, with no warning in the weather. The sky over Gloucester was a pale, washed-out gray, and the air held a damp chill that tasted of wood smoke and low tide. I was in the yard checking the alignment on a set of rudder pintles when the phone vibrated. It was Stacy. Her voice was warm, layered with a concern so perfectly calibrated, it made the skin on my forearms tighten. "Dad, Kevin and I have been talking. We just want to spend some quiet time with you today. No business. Just the 3 of us at the captain's table. 1 o'clock. I will be there," I said. I arrived at 12:50. I was wearing the leather jacket Catherine had bought me for our 30th anniversary. My phone was in my shirt pocket, the microphone angled upward, already recording. In Massachusetts, one-party consent law means a recording made by a participant is admissible in court. Arthur had confirmed this the evening before. "Let her talk, Tom. Let her lay every card on the table." The captain's table is a Gloucester institution. Dark wood booths scarred by decades of fishermen's elbows, the smell of fried haddock and coffee strong enough to strip varnish, and a roar of lunchtime conversation that provided perfect cover. Through the salt-hazed windows I could see the masts of the lobster fleet rocking at their moorings. Kevin and Stacy were already seated near the far window. Stacy wore a soft navy cardigan, her hair pulled into a neat twist, hands folded on the placemat. Kevin was staring at the menu, His shoulders hunched as though he were trying to disappear into the vinyl. I sat down. Before I could unfold my napkin, Stacy reached across and took my hand. Her fingers were smooth and cold, like something pulled from the bottom of a bait cooler. "Dad," she said, her eyes wide with a practiced liquid sympathy. "We have been so worried about you. Kevin mentioned you have been forgetful lately. The missed calls, the confusion about appointments. We just want you to know you do not have to carry all of this anymore." I said nothing. I let her hand rest on mine, like ballast I had not asked for. She began describing a residential facility on the outskirts of Rockport. Manicured gardens overlooking the Atlantic. A koi pond. 24-hour care staff. She made it sound like a harbor of refuge where a tired captain could finally drop his sails. "You would not have to worry about the yard anymore," she whispered. "The stress is what is doing this to you, Dad." Kevin finally spoke, though he did not look at me. He looked at a spot near my collar. "She is right, Dad. We have already had conversations with people who would give you a fair price for the yard. The waterfront lease. There are developers who would pay well for that kind of frontage. You built something real. You deserve to rest. While you still can." I looked at my son. His fingers were mechanically shredding a sugar packet. White grains spilling across the placemat, like sand running out of an hourglass. I slowly withdrew my hand from Stacy's and set my coffee cup down with a deliberate metallic clink that cut through the restaurant noise like a bell buoy in fog. "Are you trying to help me?" I asked. My voice was low enough to stay between us, but sharp enough to split oak. "Or are you just helping yourselves?" The warmth in Stacy's face did not fade. It vanished. It was as if someone had pulled the fuse on a navigation light, leaving nothing but a cold, dark housing. Her eyes became two chips of gray slate, the same flat mineral color as the granite ledges lining the outer harbor where the water is deep and nothing grows. She did not look at Kevin for permission. The mask simply fell away, and what was underneath had been waiting all along. "Fine," she said. Her voice was a flat clinical instrument that had no room for family. "You want to do this the hard way? Then we will do it the hard way. By Monday morning, a judge will declare you legally incapacitated. Dr. Winslow has already filed the assessment. The petition is in the system. There is not a lawyer in Essex County who can stop a medical certification at your age." I looked at Kevin. "Is this what you want, son? To put your father in a facility and sell his life's work before the caulk is dry?" Kevin did not answer. He did not defend her, and he did not defend me. He stared at the table, his jaw clenched so tight the tendons in his neck stood out like stays under too much wind. The silence he offered was the loudest and most painful sound I had heard in 72 years. Stacy stood, smoothing her cardigan with a brisk motion. She did not look like a daughter-in-law anymore. She looked like a surveyor, condemning a vessel for scrap. "Enjoy the harbor while you still can, old man," she said, and the casual cruelty landed on my chest like a cold iron shackle. "We will see you in court Monday morning. Kevin, let us go." She walked out, her heels striking the hardwood with a military precision that parted the lunch crowd like a bow wave. Kevin stood to follow. He stopped at the door for one heartbeat, his back to me, his head bowed. I watched the line of his shoulders and waited for the boy from the workshop to turn around. I waited for some flicker of the son who had sat beside me for 4 hours on a hospital bench without speaking because he knew silence was the only honest thing he had. He did not turn. He stepped through the door and into the gray afternoon, letting it swing shut behind him. I sat alone with 2 cold cups of coffee and a plate of bread no one had touched. The crowd moved around me like a current flowing past a piling. They did not know that a 45-year legacy had just been sentenced to death at a window table. I reached into my pocket and turned off the recording. The silence Kevin had left behind was louder than the entire Atlantic. I was not a victim. I was a captain who had just charted the enemy's full fleet, and on Monday they were going to discover that the harbor they thought was undefended had been mined since Thursday. I drove home from the captain's table at 2:15. I called Arthur before I pulled into the driveway. "It is done, Arthur," I said, and my voice sounded like chain being dragged through a hosepipe. She said it all: the doctor, the petition, the facility. "I have the whole thing on tape." "Everything is in place, Tom," Arthur replied. "The district attorney's office is standing by. I filed the trust documents with the clerk this afternoon as a preemptive strike. Go home. Get some rest." I almost laughed at that. Rest is for men who are not about to watch their only son try to lock them in a cage. When I walked through the front door, the scent of lemon oil and fish stew met me in the hallway. Maria was still there, standing in the kitchen much later than her usual noon departure. She did not ask about the lunch. She did not ask why I looked like I had been keel-hauled. She simply walked over, placed her small calloused hand over mine on the counter, and looked me in the eye. "Mrs. Catherine would be proud of you, Mr. Callahan," she whispered. "She always said you were the strongest man on this coast because you knew when to be quiet and when to drop anchor." I nodded. I could not trust my voice. Jimmy arrived at 7. He did not knock. He walked in with that steady, dependable stride I had watched cross the shop floor for 18 years. I sat him down in the living room and told him everything: the safe, the camera, the footage, the captain's table, the plan for Monday morning. Jimmy listened the way he listens when I'm explaining the stress points on a difficult hull repair, with a focused intensity that does not waste a single word on reaction until the full picture is clear. When I finished, he stood up, his jaw set in a hard line. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. "Just stay here tonight, Jimmy. I do not want to be alone in this house. Not tonight." He did not hesitate. He took off his work jacket, laid it over the arm of the sofa, and sat back down. "I am not going anywhere, Tom." Around 8 that evening, Arthur called again. The news had moved through the fleet the way weather moves through a harbor, fast and impossible to contain. Sal Medeiros had called 3 other captains. Captain Pete Andrade, who runs a dragger out of the inner harbor, had called 2 more. By nightfall, 8 captains from the Gloucester fishing fleet had contacted Arthur's office, volunteering to appear in court on Monday to retract their coerced complaints and testify against Stacy and Atlantic Harbor Holdings. The community that had built its life around this waterfront was closing ranks around one of its own. I did not sleep, but I did not sit in the dark either. That was for the night of the anchor pendant, the night of doubt. This night was for preparation. Around midnight, I walked down to the yard. The main shop was empty, the machines silent, the air thick with the familiar smell of sawdust and linseed oil. A half-finished skiff sat on sawhorses in Bay 3, her hull smooth and pale under the fluorescent lights. I picked up a brush and a can of spar varnish and began working the finish onto the planking. Long even strokes that followed the grain the way Catherine used to run her hand along the rail of a finished boat. Slowly, with respect for the wood, there is a specific kind of meditation in the act of applying varnish. The rhythm of the brush, the warm amber smell, the way the grain darkens and deepens as the finish soaks in. It is the boat builder's version of prayer. I worked for 2 hours, my mind emptying with each stroke until there was nothing left but the motion and the wood and the faint sound of the harbor breathing beyond the shop doors. At 2 in the morning, I walked back up to the house. I went to the cedar closet at the end of the hallway, the one that still holds a trace of Catherine's perfume, and I pulled out the charcoal gray suit. She had chosen it for me 20 years ago for Kevin's wedding. I remembered the afternoon we bought it in Boston. She had spent an hour selecting the exact shade of silk for the tie to match her dress. I had worn it 3 times since. At the wedding, at her funeral, and at an industry awards dinner where I accepted a lifetime achievement plaque that I put in a drawer and never looked at again. I laid the suit on the bed and spent the next hour ironing the shirt and pressing the creases into the trousers with the same precision I use when fitting a garboard plank to a keel. The steam rose from the iron in slow white clouds. At 3:30, I sat at the kitchen table with a tin of black polish and a horsehair brush, and worked the leather of my dress shoes until they caught the overhead light like wet obsidian. At 4, I made coffee and stood by the back door looking out at the harbor in the dark. The yard was a black shape against the slightly lighter black of the water. The old pitch pines on the bluff stood motionless, their branches reaching over the granite like the arms of men holding a line. At 5:30, I shaved with a steady hand, put on the white shirt, knotted the silk tie, and slipped into the charcoal jacket. I stopped at the hallway mirror, the one Catherine had hung the week we moved in. She told me she wanted the last thing I saw every morning to be the man she married. I looked at the reflection. 72 years old, a face mapped with scars and weather, but my back was straight and my eyes were clear. Jimmy was awake on the sofa. He stood up, rubbed his eyes, and looked at me in the suit. He did not say I looked good. He just gave a single firm nod. The kind of nod a man gives when he sees a vessel that is ready for the sea. "I will follow you down in my truck," he said. "I will be in the back of the courtroom." I picked up my keys and walked out into the cold dawn. The Ford's engine turned over and caught, a low, steady rumble that matched my heartbeat. I drove toward Salem as the sun broke the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purple and cold gold. The charcoal suit felt heavy, a suit chosen for a celebration of a son's new life. Catherine would not mind that I was wearing it for a different ceremony. Today was not a wedding. It was the day the fog was finally going to lift. Arthur McGuire and 2 officers from the District Attorney's Financial Crimes Unit were waiting on the granite steps of the Essex County Courthouse in Salem at 8:30 Monday morning. The October air was sharp enough to sting, a cold that smelled of frozen stone and the faint iodine tang of the sea 3 blocks east. Arthur looked at my charcoal suit and gave a single solemn nod. I am sitting in the courthouse parking lot, my wife's suit feeling like armor. After weeks of silence, the truth is finally ready to speak. If you have walked with me this far, please comment the number 11 to let me know you are still by my side before I face them. Certain parts of this journey involve dramatized elements. If this does not suit your interests, feel free to step away. But for those staying, the gavel is about to fall. We entered the courthouse. The marble floors echoed with the weight of our footsteps. I stood in the corridor and looked through the narrow pane of glass in the heavy door of courtroom 3B. Inside, Kevin and Stacy were seated at the petitioner's table. Stacy wore a dark blazer, her posture straight as a mast. Kevin sat beside her, hands flat on the table, staring at the wall. He looked smaller than I remembered, as if the room were slowly closing around him. Dr. Philip Winslow sat in the front row of the gallery in a white lab coat. The hearing began. Stacy's attorney stood and addressed Judge Margaret O'Brien, a woman with silver hair and eyes that had adjudicated every shade of human greed Essex County had ever produced. "Your Honor, we petition for emergency guardianship over Thomas Callahan. Mr. Callahan is 72 years old and suffering from significant cognitive decline as confirmed by Dr. Winslow's clinical assessment. Given the urgency of his financial exposure, we request that his son Kevin Callahan be appointed legal guardian with full authority over all assets immediately." Judge O'Brien looked over her spectacles. "Is Mr. Callahan present in the building?" "No, Your Honor." The attorney replied without hesitation. He was not notified due to clinical concerns regarding his mental state and the risk of a volatile reaction. Arthur did not wait another second. He pushed the heavy mahogany doors open. The hinges groaned like a vessel shifting on its cradle. I walked in behind him, my shoes striking the marble with a steady, measured rhythm that I felt in my spine. I was not the confused old man they had described. I was the man who had built the largest marine works on the North Shore, and I was wearing the suit my wife had chosen for my son's wedding. Kevin turned around. The courtroom seemed to collapse until it contained only the 2 of us. We looked at each other across 20 feet of polished wood. It was a 3-second stare, the same duration as when he had stood before the model ship in my office. But this time he did not turn away. His eyes stayed locked on mine, wide and raw and hauntingly clear. I recognized something in his face that I had not seen in years, It was not hatred or guilt. It was a terrifying, naked relief, the expression of a man who had been drowning and had finally felt the bottom beneath his feet. Stacy's face froze. Her eyes darted to her attorney, then back to me, searching for a gap in the armor that was not there. Arthur stepped to the bench. Your Honor, I am Arthur McGuire, counsel for Thomas Callahan. As the court can see, Mr. Callahan is very much present, fully competent, and acutely aware of every detail of this fraudulent petition. He laid the manila folder on the clerk's desk. We submit into evidence a motion-activated video log of the petitioner's trespassing in Mr. Callahan's private office to inventory his assets. We have an audio recording from Thursday in which Mrs. Callahan explicitly threatens Mr. Callahan with this petition unless he surrenders his company. We have a sworn affidavit from the company bookkeeper detailing coercion and blackmail by the petitioner. We have documentation of a shell company, Atlantic Harbor Holdings, used to purchase the debts of local fishermen and coerce them into filing false safety complaints. And we have the trust documentation filed last week. Mr. Callahan's assets are held in an irrevocable trust of which he is the sole trustee. This petition is legally moot and factually criminal. Judge O'Brien picked up the medical assessment and turned to the front row. Dr. Winslow, stand. The doctor stood. His white coat looked paper-thin under the courtroom lights. Dr. Winslow, did you conduct an in-person clinical evaluation of Thomas Callahan before signing this assessment under penalty of perjury? Winslow's throat moved. He looked at Stacy, then at the floor. No, Your Honor. The judge held his gaze for a long, cold moment. Your signature on this document is a direct violation of your oath. I am issuing an emergency injunction and referring the matter to the medical board for immediate suspension of your credentials. Officers, escort this individual for formal questioning. She turned to the two officers by the railing. I am referring this entire matter to the district attorney for prosecution on charges of elder financial exploitation, misrepresentation of medical testimony, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Take these individuals into custody. The officers moved forward. They placed the restraints on Stacy first. She did not scream or weep. She stood perfectly still, her face a mask of cold marble, and looked at me with a hollow hatred that confirmed everything I had seen through the camera hidden in my wife's model ship. Then they turned to Kevin. He did not resist. He stood and held out his wrists. The metal clicked shut. He looked at me across the gallery, and for the second time that morning, our eyes met. He did not plead. He did not speak. He just allowed himself to be led toward the side door, his head bowed. I watched them take my son out of that courtroom. He did not look back. The heavy door swung shut with a sound that echoed through the empty room like the last stroke of a ship's bell at the end of a long watch. I stood there after the room had cleared. Arthur was speaking with the clerk. Jimmy was in the back row, his hat in his hands. But I kept my eyes on that closed door. I was waiting for a feeling of victory. It did not come. I just felt the weight of the suit in the silence of the room and the faint smell of floor polish that reminded me of nothing and everything at once. Some ships, once wrecked, can never be fully rebuilt. They can only be refloated, patched, and sent back out to see if the hull holds. The courtroom emptied in less than 10 minutes. The silence that followed was different from the one I had lived with for the past weeks. This one did not feel like a countdown. It felt like the stillness that settles over a harbor after a storm has passed through, when the damage is done and the only thing left is to walk the waterfront and see what is still standing. Arthur stood by the mahogany rail, tucking his fountain pen into his vest pocket. He looked at me with the tired, steady eyes of a man who had seen too many families come apart in rooms like this one. "It is over, Tom," he said. I looked at the petitioner's table, still covered with the documents Stacy had prepared with such cold precision. I looked at the empty chair where Kevin had sat, staring at nothing. "No, Arthur," I said. "It is not over. You cannot unlaunch a torpedo once it has left the tube." Arthur did not argue. He walked over and gripped my shoulder, a brief, solid weight of 27 years of friendship. I will handle the paperwork with the clerk. The district attorney will be in touch by next week. Go home, Tom. I drove back to Gloucester with the October sun low and hard on the windshield. When I pulled into the driveway, Maria and Jimmy were standing on the front porch. Maria looked smaller than usual, her shoulders drawn in, a white handkerchief bunched in her fist. She had been crying. As I stepped onto the porch, she moved toward me, her voice breaking into a whisper of apology that sounded like it had been building pressure for weeks. I am sorry, Mr. Callahan. I am so sorry. I should have told you sooner. I should have been braver. I caught her by the elbows before she could go any further. I held both her hands in mine, and I felt the calluses of 15 years of honest work pressed against my palms. Maria, look at me, I said, my voice firm but as gentle as I could make it. You protected this family the only way you could. You were the victim of a man who should have known better. Catherine would have forgiven you without a second thought. And so do I. She leaned against my arm and wept, a ragged sound of relief that shook her small frame. I let her cry. There was nothing left that needed words. You are home, Maria. We are all home. Jimmy stood by the door with his hat in his hands. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The look in his eyes carried the same quiet weight as a well-set anchor, steady and reliable and deep enough to hold. That evening, Jimmy made dinner. Clam chowder from a recipe his mother had brought from the Azores. Thick with cream and potato, and chunks of quahog, and a skillet of cornbread that filled the kitchen with a warmth I had not felt in that room since Catherine was alive. The three of us sat at the kitchen table, Maria, Jimmy, and me. It was a strange assembly, a family built from loyalty rather than blood, held together, not by last names, but by the ordinary accumulation of years spent showing up. We did not talk about the courtroom. We talked about the yard, about the nor'easter that was forecast for the following week, about whether the old pitch pine on the bluff would survive another winter. We talked about nothing, and it was the most honest conversation I had been part of in months. After Maria went home and Jimmy settled onto the sofa for what had become his customary post, I picked up the phone and called Eddie Byrne. It took 4 rings. When he answered, his voice was hollow, the sound of a man bracing for the fall he knows is coming. Eddie, I said, leaning back in the kitchen chair Catherine had picked out at a yard sale in Essex 30 years ago. I am not letting you go. The yard needs a bookkeeper who understands the price of the truth. But there is a condition. Tomorrow you go to the district attorney's office voluntarily. You make a full sworn statement about the expense reports and exactly how Stacy used them. Arthur will go with you. I will stand behind you through whatever comes next. There was a long, stunned silence on the line. I could hear his ragged breathing. Why, sir? After what I did? After I gave her those files? Because you did not do it for greed, Eddie. You did it out of fear, and you stepped forward when it counted. Catherine believed in second chances for men brave enough to admit they had stumbled. It is exactly what she would have wanted me to do. After we hung up, I walked into the office. I did not sit in the dark. I turned on the desk lamp and let its warm circle fall across the model ship on the mantelpiece. The little vessel sat there, steady and patient, the camera still hidden inside its hull. I reached up to take it down, to remove the lens and restore the ship to what it had been before I turned it into a weapon. My hand hovered in the air for a moment. Then it dropped. Not tonight. Tonight I needed to remember that the truth had required a witness, and that small wooden ship had been the most faithful one I had ever known. I shifted my gaze to the armchair by the window. Catherine's chair. I sat in it, feeling the familiar contours of the cracked navy leather. I knew Arthur was wrong. This was not the end. There would be a sentencing hearing in January. There would be depositions and news coverage and the cold reality of a prison cell for my only son. But as I sat there looking out at the harbor lights reflected on the black water, The bone-deep fury I had been carrying for Kevin began to shift. It did not disappear. It changed shape. The way a swell changes when it passes over a shallow reef, becoming something slower and heavier and harder to name. I was not just angry at my son anymore. I was angry for him. I was angry that the boy who used to look at me with honest pride had let himself be dismantled plank by plank until there was nothing left but a hollow hull and someone else's hand on the tiller. 6 weeks separated the arrests from the sentencing, and each of those 42 days pressed against my ribs like ballast stones stacked wrong. I kept the yard open. I kept the coffee hot. I sanded 16 ribs on a lobster boat named Sweet Caroline and never asked the owner why he chose that name, because every vessel carries a woman someone is trying to hold on to. Work was the only language I trusted when English failed me, so I spoke it until my hands ached and the shop lights burned past midnight. Arthur called on a Tuesday morning, the 12th of December, at 7:15. I know the time because the brass ship's clock struck the quarter hour. The same instant the phone buzzed on the granite countertop. He said sentencing was set for Monday. Essex County Superior Court. Judge Margaret O'Brien. Same courtroom, same bench. Same smell of floor polish and old oak. I asked if I needed to be there. He went quiet for 3 seconds. And Arthur Maguire is never quiet. Then he said, "You do not need to be there. But you will regret it for the rest of your life if you are not." Monday arrived wrapped in the kind of cold that turns Gloucester granite almost blue. I wore the charcoal suit. I knotted the burgundy tie at the hallway mirror Catherine had hung 26 years ago and adjusted it until it sat where she would have wanted. Maria handed me a travel mug at the door and pressed her hand against my forearm without a word. Jimmy drove. We were silent until the Beverly Bridge, where he cleared his throat and said the last time he had been this nervous beside me, we were hauling a 20-screw catch off Norman's Woe in a nor'easter. I almost smiled. The courtroom felt smaller than I remembered, or maybe I was larger, filled with 6 weeks of sleepless gravity. Arthur sat at the front bench, a brown leather folio open beside him. 2 rows behind the defense table, a woman I did not recognize clutched a tissue. Mid-50s, gray cardigan. Later I learned she was Stacy's mother, driven from Hartford. She never looked at me. Kevin entered through the side door in an orange jumpsuit that swallowed his shoulders. He had lost weight. The jawline I remembered from his christening photograph now looked carved by hunger rather than youth. He found me in the gallery and held my eyes for 2 seconds before looking at his hands. Those hands once gripped a toy biplane I had carved from scrap mahogany in the shop. I could still feel the sawdust on my fingers. Stacy came next, spine straight, chin lifted, as though the courtroom were a stage and the bailiff her usher. But the calculation that had lived behind her eyes was gone, replaced by something flat and still, like harbor water after a long freeze. She looked only at the judge's bench. Judge O'Brien read the charges aloud. Elder financial exploitation. Conspiracy to commit fraud. Fraudulent medical testimony. Suborning perjury. Coercion of a witness. 3 counts of document theft. The words fell like hull, planks dropped on concrete. Heavy. Final. Impossible to set back in place. Assistant DA Rachel Torres laid out the evidence in a sequence clean enough to be a ship's construction log. The video footage. The captain's table audio. Eddie Burns' affidavit. The Atlantic Harbor Holdings filings, tracing to a single signatory, 4 wire transfers to Dr. Philip Winslow, and the falsified medical assessment for an examination Winslow admitted he never conducted. Winslow was sentenced first. 18 months of probation, a $60,000 ZU fine, expert witness certification revoked, and referral to the Massachusetts Board of Registration in Medicine. He stood with clasped hands like a man at his own funeral. His career was the body, and the courtroom was the church. Stacy's attorney requested leniency. Judge O'Brien listened, then spoke. She said the conspiracy demonstrated not a momentary lapse, but a sustained campaign to strip an elderly man of autonomy, property, and dignity. She cited the coercion of Maria, the extortion of Eddie Byrne, the weaponization of commercial debt against independent fishermen, and the recruitment of a physician to fabricate incapacitation grounds. She called it a blueprint for the disassembly of a human life. Stacy received 7 years at MCIHU Framingham. She did not flinch. She turned once toward her mother and gave a single nod. Her mother pressed the tissue to her mouth and closed her eyes. Kevin's public defender argued diminished culpability, a man caught between a manipulative spouse and a father he loved. Judge O'Brien acknowledged the argument, but noted Kevin's willing participation in at least 4 documented office entries, his personal threat against a household employee, and his silence while his wife orchestrated document theft and a fraudulent guardianship petition. Silence in the presence of exploitation, she said, is its own form of complicity. Kevin received 3 years at MCIU Concord. When the judge finished, Kevin looked at me, not the brief glance from before. He held my gaze, as though trying to read something carved on the back of my skull. I do not know what he found. I hope it was not hatred, because I did not feel hatred. I felt something worse, a sorrow so deep it had no waterline. It went down past the keel, past the ballast, into whatever dark water sits beneath the things we build to stay afloat. The bailiff touched Kevin's elbow. He turned and walked through the side door. It closed with the soft click of a latch catching, identical to the nursery door latch I had installed in 1979, the week we brought him home from Beverly Hospital. Arthur touched my shoulder. Jimmy waited at the back with folded arms. I buttoned my jacket and walked into the December air. Salem Harbor lay gray and flat between the brick buildings across the street. And for the first time in 6 weeks, the ballast in my chest shifted. Not gone, redistributed. The way a captain trims weight after a storm so the vessel can move again. Jimmy opened the passenger door. We drove north toward Gloucester, toward the shop where a half-finished skiff sat under a canvas tarp with its ribs exposed, like something that had not yet decided whether it wanted to be a boat or a coffin. I decided for it. It would be a boat. 3 days after the sentencing, I found Catherine's letter. I was not looking for it. I was looking for a receipt. The yard needed a new bandsaw blade, and I remembered filing the warranty paperwork inside the bottom drawer of the oak desk, behind a row of manila folders I had not touched since Catherine was alive. I pulled the drawer open and reached past the folders, and my fingers touched something that did not belong. A cream-colored envelope, sealed, with my name written across the front in Catherine's careful cursive. The ink was faded the way ink fades when it has been sitting in the dark for a very long time. I turned it over. On the back flap she had written a single date. November 1997. 28 years. That letter had been waiting for me longer than some marriages last. I carried it to the leather chair by the window and sat down. The harbor was silver that morning, flat and cold, and a single trawler was motoring out past the breakwater with its running lights still on. I held the envelope against my chest for a full minute before I opened it. Not because I was afraid, because I knew that whatever Catherine had written would change the shape of something I had already built in my mind, and a man who has spent 50 years shaping wood and steel understands that once you cut a plank, the grain never goes back. The letter was 2 pages, front and back, written on the pale blue stationery she used to order from a shop in Rockport that closed sometime around 2004. Her handwriting was steady on the first page and slightly looser on the second, the way it always got when she was tired or emotional. I read it once quickly, then again slowly, then a third time with my reading glasses because I wanted to make sure I had not invented a single word. She began by telling me she loved me. Not in a grand way, in the plain way she always said it, the way you describe the color of the sea when you have looked at it every morning for 30 years and no longer need adjectives. She said she loved our life. The yard, the house, the smell of varnish in my hair when I came to bed. Then she said she was writing because she needed to tell me something she could not say out loud while she was still healthy enough to say it. She wrote about Kevin. She said she had watched him change after he married Stacy. slowly, the way a tide changes. You do not notice it moving until the rocks you were standing on are underwater. She described specific moments. A Thanksgiving in 1995 when Stacy redirected every conversation back to money. A Christmas in 1996 when Kevin asked about the value of the waterfront lease for the first time. Using language Catherine said sounded rehearsed, as though someone had written the question for him. A Sunday dinner in the spring of 1997 when Stacy asked Maria how many rooms the house had, not out of curiosity, but with the particular attention of a person measuring something she intended to acquire. Catherine wrote that she did not blame Kevin entirely. She said he had always been soft wood in certain places, easy to shape if you applied pressure at the right grain. She worried that Stacy had found those places early and pressed. She worried that by the time I noticed, the shaping would be finished and the piece would be set. Then came the paragraph that stopped my breath. She wrote, "Tom, if you are reading this, I am probably gone, and something has probably happened that made you open this drawer. I do not know what it will be, but I know you, and I know you will handle it the way you handle every storm, by checking the hull, checking the rigging, and steering into the wind. I am asking you to do one more thing. When the storm passes, do not throw Kevin overboard. He is your son. He is also mine. Whatever he has done, there is still good wood under the rot, and you are the only man alive who knows how to find it." I set the letter on my knee and looked at the harbor. The trawler had passed the breakwater and was heading northeast toward the fishing grounds, growing smaller against the gray horizon. I thought about Catherine sitting at this same desk in November 1997, writing these words while I was probably in the shop, sanding a transom or bending a plank, completely unaware that my wife was mapping a future I had not yet arrived at. She had seen the fog 28 years before I did. She had seen it, and she had not panicked. She had simply written a letter, sealed it, slipped it behind the folders, and trusted that I would find it when I needed it. I pressed my thumb across her signature at the bottom of the second page. The ink was so old it did not smudge. Beside her name she had drawn a small anchor, the same anchor she used to doodle on grocery lists and birthday cards. A simple curved shape with a crossbar that looked more like a child's drawing than a nautical symbol. But it meant everything she ever believed about holding fast. Maria knocked on the office door around 10. She brought coffee and saw the letter on my knee. She did not ask what it was. She looked at the handwriting, looked at my face, and set the mug on the side table without a word. On her way out, she paused at the doorframe and said, very quietly, "She always knew, Mr. Tom. She always knew." I stayed in that chair until noon. I read the letter 2 more times. I thought about the sentencing, about Kevin's face when the judge read 3 years, about the click of the courtroom door that sounded like a nursery latch. I thought about what Catherine had asked me to do. Do not throw him overboard. Find the good wood under the rot. I folded the letter along its original creases and slid it back into the envelope. I did not put it in the drawer. I put it in the inside pocket of my vest, against my chest, where I could feel the edge of the paper every time I breathed. Then I picked up the phone and called Arthur. I told him I wanted to understand the process for prison visitation at MCIUA Concord. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I will have the forms on your desk by tomorrow morning." The anchor on the bottom of Catherine's letter was still warm against my ribs. It had waited 28 years to do its job. Now it was holding. Arthur had the visitation forms on my desk by 8 the next morning. Just as he promised. There were 4 pages, each one printed in that particular shade of government gray that makes everything feel heavier than it needs to be. I filled them out at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold before I finished the second page. Name of inmate. Relationship to inmate. Purpose of visit. I wrote father in the relationship box and stared at the word for a long time. It looked strange on a correctional facility form, like finding a rose pressed inside a machinery manual. The approval came back in 11 days. MCIU Concord, allowed Saturday visits between 1 and 3 in the afternoon. I could bring nothing except my identification, one car key, and $20 in coins for the vending machines. No phones, no recording devices, no paper, no pens. I understood the restrictions. A prison is a hull stripped to the waterline. Everything unnecessary is removed so the structure can hold. Jimmy offered to drive. I told him no. This was a trip I needed to make alone. The way a captain walks the length of his vessel before dawn, checking every joint and seam without an audience. I left Gloucester at 10 on a Saturday morning in early January. The sky was the color of wet cement, and the roads were salted white. Route 128 south to Route 2 west, then the turn toward Concord, past stone walls and bare oaks that looked like the skeletons of something winter had not finished killing. MCIO Concord sat behind a perimeter of chain link and razor wire on a flat stretch of ground that could have been a parking lot if someone had made different choices about what to build there. I parked in a visitor lot that held maybe 30 cars, most of them older models with rust along the wheel wells. A woman 2 spaces over was buckling a toddler into a car seat, and the child was crying in the particular way children cry when they are tired of places they do not understand. I watched them for a moment before I got out. Then I walked to the entrance, showed my identification, signed the log, passed through a metal detector, and followed a corrections officer down a corridor that smelled like floor wax and cafeteria steam. The visiting room was large and bright, which surprised me. I had expected something darker. Instead, there were rows of molded plastic chairs arranged in pairs across small square tables, fluorescent lights humming overhead, and a row of vending machines along the far wall. A mural someone had painted years ago covered the east side. A landscape of rolling hills and a river that did not exist anywhere in Concord, but existed in the mind of whoever had needed to put it there. I sat at table 14 and waited. Kevin came through a steel door on the left side of the room. He wore a khaki uniform and white sneakers that squeaked against the tile. His hair was shorter than I had ever seen it. He looked 10 years older than the man who had sat across from me at the captain's table, and it had only been 2 months. He saw me, stopped for half a step, and then continued walking. He sat down across from me and placed his hands flat on the table, palms down, fingers spread, as though he needed to prove they were empty. Neither of us spoke for what felt like a full minute. The fluorescent lights buzzed. A child laughed somewhere behind me. A vending machine clunked and dispensed something that rattled down its metal throat. Kevin spoke first. He said, "I did not think you would come," I said. "I almost did not." He nodded. He looked at his hands. He said, "I do not know where to start." "Dad." I told him he did not have to start anywhere. I told him I had not come for an apology or an explanation. I told him I had come because his mother had asked me to. And then I watched his face collapse, the way a bulkhead collapses when the fasteners give out all at once. Not slowly, not gracefully, but in a single structural failure that leaves everything behind it exposed. He pressed his palms against his eyes and his shoulders shook. He did not make a sound. In 50 years of building vessels, I have watched men handle grief in every possible way, and the quietest grief is always the heaviest, because it has nowhere to go except deeper into the hull. When he lowered his hands, his eyes were red and wet. He said, "She knew, did she not?" I said, "She knew before either of us did." He asked what the letter said. I told him the truth. I told him Catherine had seen the pattern as early as 1995, that she had described the way Stacy measured everything in the house, with the attention of someone planning an acquisition. I told him she had used the phrase soft wood, and I watched him flinch, because he understood exactly what it meant. Then I told him the last part, that Catherine had asked me not to throw him overboard, that she believed there was still good wood under the rot, and that she trusted me to find it. Kevin stared at the table. A muscle in his jaw tightened and released 3 times. Then he said, very quietly, "I do not know if she was right." I leaned forward and I said, "That is not your decision. That is mine. And I have not made it yet. But I am here, Kevin. I drove an hour and a half in January to sit in a plastic chair under fluorescent lights because your mother asked me to look. So I am looking. He met my eyes then. Fully. For the first time since the courtroom. What I saw was not the relief I had expected. It was fear. The specific fear of a man who has been offered something he knows he does not deserve and is terrified he will destroy it a second time. I recognized that fear. I had seen it in the eyes of apprentices the first time I handed them a chisel and a piece of old-growth oak and said, "Do not waste this." A buzzer sounded. The corrections officer announced 10 minutes remaining. Around us, families began their slow rituals of separation. Lingering handshakes, whispered instructions. Children lifted onto hips. Kevin looked toward the steel door and then back at me. He said, "Will you come again?" I said, "Saturday." He nodded. He stood. He turned toward the door, and just before he reached it, he stopped and looked back over his shoulder. He did not say anything. He did not wave. He just looked. The way a man on a departing vessel looks back at the harbor, trying to memorize the shape of it in case the sea changes everything. The drive home took longer than the drive down because I took Route 2 slowly, letting the traffic pass me. Bare trees lined both sides of the road like ribs of an unfinished hull. Somewhere near Lexington, the sun broke through the clouds for exactly 90 seconds and lit the salt-white road until it looked almost silver, almost like a harbor at dawn. Then the clouds closed again and the road went gray. But I had seen it. 90 seconds was enough. I went back the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that, and every Saturday for the next 14 months. I never missed one. Not when a nor'easter dropped 18 inches on Cape Ann in February. Not when I caught a chest cold in March that turned my voice into something that sounded like a bilge pump running dry. Not when Jimmy told me I was pushing too hard and needed to rest. I told Jimmy that rest was for men who had finished their work, and mine was not finished. The first 4 visits were the hardest. Kevin spoke in short sentences, careful and measured. Like a man walking across a frozen pond who tests every step before committing his weight. He told me about his cell, his daily routine, the job they had assigned him in the prison woodshop. I almost laughed when he said woodshop. 50 years I had tried to get that boy interested in working with his hands, and it took a state correctional facility to put a saw in his grip. He said he was building bookshelves, simple joints, pine boards, nothing that required real skill. But he described the grain of the wood the way I describe it, running his thumb along an invisible surface as he talked, and I knew that something I had planted decades ago was finally finding soil. By the 6th visit, he started talking about Stacy. Not with anger, not with the defensive loyalty I had expected. He spoke about her the way a man speaks about a current that carried him somewhere he never intended to go. He said he had known, somewhere beneath the daily noise of marriage, that what she wanted from my estate was not protection for their future but acquisition of mine. He said he had told himself it was normal for a wife to think about finances. He said he had repeated that sentence so many times it became a wall he could hide behind. And by the time the wall crumbled, the water was already over his head. I listened. I did not interrupt. I did not tell him he should have seen it sooner, because I should have seen it sooner too. And Catherine had seen it before either of us, and had the grace to write a letter instead of a lecture. Judgment is easy from dry land. Understanding requires getting into the water. Around visit 10, Kevin asked about the yard. He wanted to know if I had finished the skiff. I told him I had. I told him I had named her Second Chance and launched her off the dock on a Tuesday morning in April, with nobody watching except Maria and a cormorant that had been roosting on the piling since September. He smiled at that. It was the first real smile I had seen from him since before the trial. Not wide, not dramatic, just a slight lifting at the corners that changed the architecture of his entire face. I told him the skiff handled well in the inner harbor, light on the tiller, responsive, the kind of vessel that forgives a clumsy hand because the hull was built to absorb mistakes. He understood what I was saying. He looked at the table and nodded slowly, and I watched him swallow something that was not food. Maria sent him cookies every month. Oatmeal raisin, his favorite since childhood, packed in a tin that the prison staff inspected and transferred to a plastic bag before delivering. He told me he shared them with his cellmate, a quiet man from Worcester who was serving 2 years for a fraud conviction and played chess every evening in the common room. I liked that Kevin shared. It meant the rot had not reached the center. Jimmy visited once, in June. He told me afterward that Kevin had gripped his hand so hard across the table that his knuckles turned white, and that Kevin had said only one sentence: "Thank you for staying with him." Jimmy repeated that sentence to me in the truck on the way home, and then stared out the window for 20 miles without speaking. Some words do not need commentary. They just need air. Arthur filed the final civil motions in the spring. Atlantic Harbor Holdings was dissolved by court order. The purchased debts held over the Gloucester captains were voided. Sal Medeiros called me on a Wednesday evening and thanked me in a voice that kept breaking on every third word. I told him he owed me nothing. He said he owed me the boat under his feet, which was close enough to everything. Eddie Byrne completed his cooperation agreement with the district attorney and received no criminal charges. He came to the yard on a Saturday morning, stood in the doorway of the shop with his cap in his hands, and said he was sorry. I told him to put his cap on, pick up a sander, and get to work on the starboard rail of a chrysocraft that had been waiting 3 weeks for attention. He did. He has not missed a day since. Pastor Frank stopped by the house every other Thursday for coffee. We did not always talk about Kevin or the trial. Sometimes we talked about the Red Sox or the price of diesel or whether the new harbor master actually understood tidal charts. But occasionally, usually around the second cup, Frank would look at me over the rim of his mug and say something that landed in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time, the way a good fastener finds the pilot hole without being forced. One evening he said, "Forgiveness is not a feeling, Tom. It is a heading. You point the bow that direction, and you hold it, even when the current pushes you sideways." I wrote that on a scrap of mahogany with a pencil and pinned it to the shop wall above my workbench. The 14th month arrived in late February. Arthur called to tell me Kevin's release date had been confirmed for the first week of March. 14 months early, on good behavior. I hung up the phone and stood at the kitchen window looking at the harbor. The ice was breaking up along the edges, gray sheets cracking apart and drifting with the outgoing tide, and I thought about how many things in this world break apart not because they are weak, but because the season simply changes, and what was frozen is finally allowed to move. I opened the desk drawer where Catherine's letter had waited for 28 years. The drawer was empty now, because the letter was still in my vest pocket, where it had been every single day since December. I touched the paper through the fabric. Then I walked to the shop, uncovered the workbench, and began building a new frame. Kevin came home on a Thursday morning in the first week of March. I did not go to the prison to collect him. Arthur handled the paperwork, and Jimmy drove the truck to Concord, because I needed to be somewhere else. I needed to be in the shop. I had spent the previous 48 hours finishing what I had started in February. A new workbench for the east wall of the shop, built from reclaimed white oak, I had pulled from the hull of a retired fishing trawler 2 summers earlier. The wood was dense and scarred, full of nail holes and salt stains, and the kind of character you cannot buy from a lumber yard. I had planed it smooth, joined the boards with hand-cut dovetails, and sealed the surface with 3 coats of marine varnish until it glowed the color of dark honey. Above the bench, I mounted a pegboard and hung a starter set of tools: a block plane, a coping saw, 2 chisels, a marking gauge, a rasp, and a small brass-handled mallet I had bought at an estate sale in Rockport 15 years ago and never used because it had always felt like it was waiting for someone else's hand. I set a folding chair beside the bench. On the chair, I placed a canvas apron, new, with the Callahan Marine Works patch Maria had stitched onto the chest pocket. And on the workbench itself, exactly in the center, I laid a single sheet of paper. On it, I had drawn, in pencil, the construction plans for a 12-foot dinghy. Simple lines, simple hull. A boat small enough to build in a month and sturdy enough to last a generation. At the top of the page I had written 2 words. Start here. Then I went to the house and made coffee. Jimmy's truck pulled into the gravel drive at 11:15. I heard the engine first, then the tires on the stones, then the driver's door, then a pause that lasted long enough for me to set down my mug and stand at the kitchen window. Kevin stepped out of the passenger side wearing jeans and a gray sweatshirt and carrying a clear plastic bag that held whatever personal items the state of Massachusetts returns to a man when it is done with him. He stood in the driveway and looked at the house the way you look at something you are not sure you are allowed to touch. Jimmy said something I could not hear. Kevin nodded. Jimmy clapped him on the shoulder and got back in the truck and drove away, because Jimmy always knows when to leave. I opened the kitchen door. Kevin looked at me across 30 feet of gravel and cold March air. He did not move. I did not move. The harbor behind him was steel blue and still, and a single lobster boat was motoring out past the breakwater with its engine drumming low and steady, the way engines do when they are warm, and the captain knows exactly where he is going. I said, "Coffee is hot." He walked toward the door. His steps were slow, deliberate, each one placed with the care of a man who has learned that ground is not always solid. He came up the porch steps and stopped in front of me. He was thinner than the last visit. His eyes were clear. He smelled like institutional soap and bus exhaust and something underneath both of those that I recognized from 44 years of knowing him. "My son," he said, "Dad." Just that. One syllable that carried the entire weight of everything we had lost, and everything we were about to find out if we could rebuild. I stepped aside and let him in. Maria was at the stove. She had cooked enough food for 5 people because Maria has always believed that grief and healing both require the same remedy, which is a full table. She looked at Kevin and her eyes filled and she said, "Welcome home, mijo," which is what she had called him since he was 30 years old and pretended to dislike it. He hugged her. She held on for a long time. I let them have that. We ate at the kitchen table, the 3 of us, and nobody mentioned the trial or the prison or the sentencing or Stacy or any of the things that had broken this family into pieces over the past 2 years. We talked about the weather. We talked about the yard. Maria told a story about a seagull that had stolen an entire sandwich from the porch railing the previous Tuesday, and Kevin laughed. Not the cautious smile from the visiting room. A laugh. It came from somewhere deep enough that I knew it was real. And it filled the kitchen the way sound fills the cabin of a well-built boat, resonating off every surface until the whole structure hums. After breakfast, I said, "Come with me." We walked across the yard to the shop. I pulled open the wide doors and the smell hit us both at the same time. Sawdust, varnish, salt air, and old iron. Kevin stood in the doorway. His eyes moved across the room, past the bandsaw and the drill press and the steam box and the racks of clamps, until they landed on the new workbench against the east wall. He saw the apron on the chair. He saw the tools on the pegboard. He saw the plans on the bench. He walked to the bench slowly and picked up the sheet of paper. He read the 2 words at the top, and his jaw tightened the way it had in the visiting room when I told him about Catherine's letter. He set the paper down and ran his hand across the surface of the bench, feeling the grain of the reclaimed oak the way I had taught him to feel wood when he was 9 years old. Palm flat, fingers relaxed, letting the texture speak. He picked up the brass-handled mallet and turned it over in his hand. He looked at me. I looked at him. Neither of us said a word. Because in 50 years of building things, I have learned that the most important moments in a shop are the ones where nobody speaks and the wood and the man come to an understanding on their own. He set the mallet down. He put on the apron. He tied it behind his back, with hands that shook slightly at the knot. Then he pulled the folding chair up to the bench, sat down, and studied the plans. I walked to my own bench on the west wall, 12 feet away, and picked up a hand plane. I began working on a cedar plank I had been shaping for 3 days, and the sound of the blade moving across the wood filled the shop with a rhythm as old and steady as breathing. Outside, the harbor was clearing. The last of the winter fog was lifting off the water in thin, pale sheets, dissolving into a sky that was turning. Slowly and without hurry, the precise shade of blue that tells a man on the coast the season has turned and the building can begin again. If this story touched you, leave a comment and tell me, have you ever had to rebuild something that was broken by someone you loved? Share your experience. And if you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss one.